Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Sri Sen, and I am a Policy and Training Associate with JPAL South Asia. I will be moderating today's roundtable session on instrument design. There are a few seats available at the table itself, so if some of you who are sitting at the back would like to come forward, please. Before we start the session, we would like a round of introductions, so if each of you could please just introduce yourselves and which organization you are from. We could start with you.
Lakshman Sharma from PH5. Okay. Lakshman Sharma from PH5.
Amit Sharma, PHFI.
Siddharth Pillai from Sesame Workshop, India.
Santosh Kumar Jha from Landisa, India.
Anirudh from Iconet, India.
PK Chaurasia from NCERT.
This is Robin Sarkar from Shivnara Foundation.
I'm Tapati from the International AIDS Vaccine Initiative.
I'm Rishi from Catalyst Management Services.
I'm Shahil from IFAD.
I'm Dr. Dushyant Bahal from CMS.
This is Priyanka from Amaltash Consulting.
This is Chandra Mallika from IIDS.
This is Dr. Vinod Mishra from IIDS.
I'm Pooja from ILFS Social Inclusion Group.
I'm Sukriti from RED Training.
Marie-Charlotte Buisson from International Water Management Institute.
Arjit from International Water Management Institute.
Dr. Manoj Patki from Public Health Foundation of India. Hi.
Dr. Shailesh from Public Health Foundation of India.
Dr. Pratap from Public Health Foundation of India.
Sangeeta Tikiani from Public Health Foundation of India.
Kapil from PH.
Deepa Nakchadri from the Makasa Foundation.
I'm Aparna John from Oxford Policy Management.
I'm Girija Bhayati from Oxford Policy Management.
I'm Wahid Fatima from Monsoon Trust.
I'm Aryamala Prasad from the World Bank.
Hi, I'm Manisha from NAC.
Good afternoon, everybody. Ajit from Amaltash Consulting.
Hi, I'm Mahona from Population Foundation of India.
Alora from Population Foundation of India.
Nimrat Kanpur, Azim Premji Foundation.
Akshika Bansal from Center for Civil Society.
Hello, I am Pradeep Panda. I am from Micro Insurance Academy.
Denny John, Micro Insurance Academy.
Thank you. I would like now to call John Floretta now, the Deputy Director of JPAL South Asia and Clear South Asia, to the stage to share a few words with us, please.
Great. Hi, everybody, and thanks everybody for coming. This is the third roundtable event that we've hosted as part of Clear South Asia. So Clear South Asia is based at JPAL South Asia, and it's an initiative that we just finished our first year, and we're beginning to start our next 2 years. And it's kind of focusing on both building better services, better M&E services in the region of South Asia, and also trying to link to kind of policy demand for evaluation within the region as well. So over the last year, some of the key work we've been doing has been on trainings. So we've done trainings for NGO, foundations, civil society partners in basic M&E, advanced M&E, and JPAL's kind of specific area of focus has been impact evaluations. We've done that as well. And increasingly, we're looking for opportunities to help build evaluation systems of kind of key partners. So we've been working with BROC in Bangladesh. We've been working with Pratham, which has been a long partner in Asia. And we've also been working with JPAL in the world. Going ahead, what we're hoping to do in the next couple of years is really continue to do some of the training and some of the more hands-on capacity building, but also to increase kind of the networking of the broader monitoring and evaluation community, and begin to take some steps towards seeing how evidence from evaluations can kind of be one of the things that's inputting in policy. So we'll be definitely looking for your support and ideas about how best to do that. So this third roundtable is focusing on instrument design. And so by instrument here, what we mean is like structured interviews. Structured interviews and kind of the surveys. So that's been a big part, obviously, of JPAL's work. JPAL South Asia has done 70 evaluations in India since 2007. And our focus has been on randomized evaluations or randomized control trials. So a big part of that is being able to try to assess in a quantitative manner the impact of the program compared to what would have happened if the program weren't implemented. And so we rely a lot on structured interviews and a lot on surveying. So part of this is to try to share some of that experience with you. Not necessarily as a way that presenting on the final word, but the presentations will be about 20 minutes long, but try to have plenty of room for interaction and to hear from you and what opportunities and challenges you guys face when you're doing surveys. So Diva Dhar will start off. Diva is a policy and training manager at JPAL. She used to be a research manager. She's also helping to lead our efforts for Clear South Asia. And she'll be focusing on kind of the process of designing a survey instrument. Harini Kannan will be next. And what we is this, you can have a very, what you think is going to be a very effective instrument to answering the questions what you want. But the absolute key process is piloting that and kind of that iterative process between piloting your instrument and then going back and redesigning. So she'll be focusing and sharing her experiences as a research fellow and as a program manager at JPAL in doing piloting and training for surveys. But we also want to take a step back and kind of focus on other means of putting together a survey or an instrument. So in JPAL, we do have some participatory processes, but it's often kind of very research focused, so we can get the questions that we think matter to policymakers. Now Gita Gopal is a close partner of CLEAR. She's representing Janasree and the gender division of Janasree. And through partnering with CLEAR, Gita has taken quite a different approach to designing an instrument, which she's going to share. It's been focusing very heavily on the ownership of communities in what information we're exploring there. And so specifically the participatory process of how that was done. Really, the instrument that she designed came from the communities itself. And she'll describe that process that she's been going through. And so I think what we hope to do over the course of the next few months is probably by the end of the year do another 3 seminars, another 3 roundtables, and they'll be focusing on other parts of kind of the data collection process. So the last one, as you know, is on theory of change. This one is on designing an instrument. I think the next ones will probably be on some of the data management, perhaps managing field teams, and also the cleaning process and maybe some the initial things in the analysis process. So without further ado, we'll probably get started with the session. And I would just like to encourage you guys to ask lots of questions and keep this as interactive as possible. So thank you very much.
Thank you, John. Our first speaker today is Diva Dhar, who will be presenting on the fundamentals and importance of instrument design. Diva is a policy and training manager for JPAL South Asia at IFMR and Clear South Asia. Diva works on strengthening monitoring, evaluation capacity in the region and promoting evidence-based policy and decision-making. She has previously worked as a research manager and a project associate for JPAL and IPA in India and Morocco. She has overseen several randomized evaluations dealing with education, gender, urban services, governance, and microcredit in India. She has worked as a consultant for the Planning Commission previously. Today she will present on the fundamentals of instrument design. Welcome, Diva.
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. I'm going to present on the fundamentals of instrument design. My presentation is going to give you an overview of data collection methods and then delve a little deeper into some pointers for designing surveys, deciding what to ask, who to ask, and how to ask it. It's also going to talk a little bit about structuring and formatting and give some helpful resources and inputs for questionnaire design. So a lot of people in this room are engaged in monitoring and evaluation and data collection. And so there's a lot of collective experience on different methods to collect data. So I'd like to ask you from sitting around, what are the different methods your firms and organizations have used for MNE?
Asking questions.
So surveys of individuals or households. What are the other means that people have used here or are familiar with? Focus group discussions, qualitative.
In-depth interviews.
Right. Other qualitative methods like rapid rural appraisals, stakeholder interviews, key informant interviews.
PBS, polling booth survey. Polling booth surveys.
So other kinds of surveys as well. There are many others which JPAL and I'm sure other organizations in this room have used. They include just official data, administrative records, logs and diaries. So ways of tracking respondents' information for longer periods of time to make it easier to collect frequent data. There are games and choice problems. So to test behavior, there are different kinds of behavioral games that you can play. There are health and education tests and measures. We talked a little bit about this in the first roundtable. We'd given examples of anthropometric tests, HemoQ tests, education tests that can be administered to test levels of learning, as well as observations and audits, and things like geospatial data, so GIS data, geospatial mapping. So these are all different data collection methods. In this presentation, I'm going to focus a lot more on survey design, but I will also touch on a few of the other data collection methods and piloting and designing of those. So the first step is having a clear sense of the questionnaire and the interventions theory of change. The first thing you might ask yourself is, how is this question relevant to the study? What information does it provide on the phenomenon being studied? And how will the responses be analyzed? So usually, typically questions cover either covariates, so background information on the respondents, things like gender, age, household size, things that are important to classify or categorize the respondents, as well as outcomes. These could include intermediate, long-term outcomes, primary outcomes, or secondary interest outcomes. And a best practice while actually listing out these different indicators is having a participatory process where you involve program stakeholders, the implementers, but also the beneficiaries, other experts from the area, and consult previous surveys and instruments that have been used for this purpose. Then based on feasibility, time, cost, and importance, one can shortlist the indicators that are central to the research question being studied. Questionnaires are often organized as modules, so components or subcomponents which focus on a particular theme. And within modules, there should be a logical order that flows from the general to the more specific, from the factual to the attitudinal and behavioral, and from the least sensitive to the most sensitive questions. The logic behind this is that while asking sensitive questions, which should be left to the last, surveyors have time to build a rapport with the respondent, with the individual, so the individual feels more comfortable sharing attitudinal information and sensitive information. And should the respondent feel uncomfortable and want to stop the interview, then at least the survey has managed to capture the earlier information which was factual. While ordering modules, it's also important to watch out for priming and for to order your questions strategically. Priming can happen if there are certain questions or modules which are suggestive and can influence your respondents' answers. This is going to be covered more in the second presentation today. While deciding what to ask, it's important to remember that the art of designing instruments is to a large extent the art of choosing the right units of observation. The units of observation are basically for each section what the section or questions are about. Some of these are fairly simple choices. When asking for individual attributes, sex, age are clearly things you should include in the survey. But when asking for getting a snapshot, for example, of a household's credit history or behavior, there's a range of different options, and one has to think about what are the different ways one can ask this question. So for example, you can ask for all current outstanding loans. One can ask for all loans taken and repaid in the last 1 year. Or you can ask for a broader unit of observation, which is the house's borrowing events, which include all the times it failed to take or get a loan. So the choice between these different units of observation is determined both by the analytical use and also by the reliability of the information you hope to get from the survey. Another important decision while framing a survey is who to ask. So who should the target respondent be? For each module, the target respondent is usually the person who's the most informed. So for example, if I was doing a survey of teaching learning materials, there could be for a number of respondents who I could ask. There could be the headmaster, teachers, the school management committee, the students' parents, or the students themselves. So if I were to ask, for example, around who would you think is the most appropriate respondent for a module focused on teaching learning materials and why? I know there are a lot of people who work in education, so I'm hoping to hear from some of you. Students? Okay, so why would you choose students?
The actual impact of the teaching learning material, that can be measured by the students only.
Okay, so students have a first-hand experience of the teaching learning materials, so they might be the most appropriate choice.
Yeah.
Compared to teachers who might have...
Teachers may be secondary because they have to handle the materials.
So teachers see the materials, they handle them, but they might have a vested interest in exaggerating the use of teaching learning materials, so you might not get an accurate picture. Parents often don't know what's happening in the school, so parents in the school management committee might not be ideal respondents. So the modules, one should think through a little bit about who the respondent for each of these modules should be, and then accordingly the questions should be designed based on your choice of respondent. So while deciding how to frame and design these questions, there are a few important things to keep in mind. Questions should be valid, that is, they should measure what they are intended to measure. They should be reliable in the sense that if those set of questions are administered at different times to different samples of the population, they should be able to yield the same results. And questions should be unbiased. They should be asked in a way that gets respondents to give accurate answers. To do this, there's a few guidelines which I'm going to share in the presentation. And the more detailed set of checklist is going to be handed out to you, or you might already have the handouts, which have a list of things that one should look for while designing and framing questions. So key things to think about are the type of question, how the question is worded and phrased, the time frame and recall periods used in the question, estimation techniques, the unit of measurement, and detailed response codes. So you're all familiar, I'm sure, with the different types of questions. There are questions that are open-ended or closed-ended. Open-ended questions are often useful when you don't know the answers that are likely to emerge from the question, when you don't have a good sense of what the different responses are going to be. But if you're trying to produce a summary picture of the population and you have a sense of what the major responses are, then it might be useful to go with a closed-ended approach. So for example, if you're asking about, if you want to get reasons from parents for not sending their children to school, you can have an open-ended question, such as the following: why don't you send your child to school? But this comes, this is a little loaded. It comes with a judgment, why don't you send your child to school? And it might be more effective to have a closed-ended question which lists out the reasons for not sending a child to school. It also makes this easier during the analysis phase if you already have a list of answer choices available. There are single and multiple response questions. There are also questions which are based on ratings. So ratings are ordinal measurements which can be useful to gauge people's, to get indications of people's opinions or perceptions, for example. So the Likert scales are very commonly used rating scale. So for example, to measure attitudes of a community, one can ask questions about gender attitudes or aspirations for children to the extent they agree or disagree with the statement at hand. A similar kind of question are ranked responses. These basically differentiate between different options and gauge the level of respondents feel between various responses. So for example, if we're looking at different teaching learning materials and you want to get a sense of which ones are prioritized or most commonly used by the respondents, you can ask for them not only to mark the ones they use, but to be able to rank between the different choices. The assumptions that go with this are that the respondents actually know about all the different items so they can make a comparative judgment, and that they feel differently about these items. Also, ranking and ratings involve a lot more mental effort, and they require time for the respondents to think through the different options. So usually it's not recommended to have a long list of options when you're asking respondents to rank them. It should usually be not exceed 6 or 7 options. Another important factor to keep in mind is having clear definitions. So different surveys, for example, use different definitions of household and income. And it's important that the researcher, the implementer, the surveyor, and the respondents have a good sense of these different terms and understand them similarly. So for example, a household can be defined in a couple of different ways. The census defines it as a group of persons who usually have their meals together, whereas the DLHS defines it as a group of people who usually live together, or people who spend the night together in the same household. And these are different versions, and it's important to have a common understanding of the measurements that you're going to use in the survey. Similarly, with income, it's good to be able to define what you include as income or not. Income can be compensation, so salary or money wage, or it can also include in-kind compensation. Does it include rent? Does it include government transfers, welfare payments, pensions? It's good to be able to distinguish and have sure that everyone in the research team is on a common definition. So for example, I've taken a couple of survey questions that were used in existing surveys, and just to sort of ask you, how do you think these questions could be improved? So for example, with a question like, what proportion of children do not know the basics? A question which is administered to teachers in schools. How could this question be strengthened? Exactly. So what do you mean by basics? The basics need to be defined. Often, I might think of the basics as being able to recognize letters and alphabets. Someone else might define it as being able to read paragraphs. So having a clear definition that is spelled out to the respondents and to the surveyors is very helpful in getting more precise estimates. Similarly, when thinking about do officers monitor the schools regularly needs to be defined. Someone might think once in 6 months is regular enough for the officers. Others might think it should be a monthly activity. So having a common definition is helpful. It's important to think about how your questions are time-bound. There should be appropriate time and recall periods used in these questions. There's often a trade-off between memory bias from a long duration of reporting and a lot of variation when you're asking questions over a short period of time. However, things, it's advisable for things like that are for consumption, for example, of groceries or water, to ask questions over a short period of time, like a day or a week. Whereas for longer term occurrences such as illnesses, which don't happen as frequently, one would tend to ask that over like a month or 3 months or 6 months because they don't happen on a frequent basis. Reference periods can also be different over different modules and sections, but it's important to not confuse your respondent, to not throw them off by changing it around too much or not having it organized in a proper way. At the same time, it can also present a problem when you're trying to combine or compare across modules during the analysis. So thinking about some uniformity or how you structure it is important. Estimation techniques are also an important part of instrument design. A lot of surveys involve questions that help estimate distance to school, distance to the water source, time taken to travel to a certain place, or the amount of a certain item that's consumed, like soap or water. To be able to get simple estimates and precise estimates, one can think about different kinds of instrument techniques. So for example, if you're thinking about tools and benchmarks for measuring distance, in addition to just asking respondents and cross-checking with other households in the area or cross-checking with the enumerator who can provide his own response, you can also collect GPS data. So GPS data between the household and the school to be able to measure the actual distance between the 2 points. One can also provide other tools and benchmarks. So to get an idea of height or of the amount of soap that's consumed by a household, one can provide different scales that can be taken by enumerators to these households to make the calculations a lot simpler and more than just guesstimates. At the same time, calculations can also be broken down when you're designing your instrument. So for example, asking a household about their consumption of water for an entire week can be a fairly complicated process if people don't have a sense of the number of liters that were consumed. So breaking it down by, let's see, the number of bottles that were used or the number of vessels that were used, and then calculating the number of liters for each one of them can be ways to minimize the calculation burden on the household and the respondents themselves. So while we're also talking about designing questions, it's important to think about how you're designing the answers to these closed-ended questions. A lot of time and energy goes into designing and having detailed response codes. While designing these response codes, it's important to know that each one of them should be mutually exclusive. So there should be no overlap between the different answer choices that you're offering. They shouldn't be too broad that it applies to everyone, and they shouldn't be too narrow that it applies to no one. That it should also exhaust all possible likelihood answers. And a lot of this involves piloting and background information, qualitative research, and Harini will talk more about this in her presentation. So I just wanted to add that having closed options, there should also always be a provision for another option that you might not have thought of or included, or an exceptional case. So you can always include an other, or other with space to specify what that option might be when making the questions.
I'm sorry, can you go over number 3 again?
So respondents will not all provide the same response. That's if you have the response choices shouldn't be so broad that all responses are, that one response applies to everybody. So they shouldn't be neither too narrow. So if it's too narrow, it won't apply to anyone. And if it's too broad, then all respondents will end up answering the same or marking the same choice. In that sense, it doesn't give you any information or yield sort of the more nuanced differences between answer choices. Especially when you're working among populations that have a hard time, among illiterate populations or pictures might be stronger, a better way of representing options than words. So this is an example from a JPAL study that was done in Orissa to monitor the conditions of stoves. So having to actually explain the different conditions through words and sentences might be a lot more complicated than having a pictorial representation of the different conditions. So respondents could look at this and basically figure out which picture was most applicable to their situation, thus making it a lot easier for them to understand the different options. And finally, it's important to think about the structure and format. A lot of data collection is now moving to digital data collection, but for things like paper surveys, it's important to think about skips. So skips and filters. So you can jump through questions and respondents don't have to answer questions that are not applicable to them. So for example, if you haven't taken any credit in the last year, you don't have to answer or go through questions which don't apply to you on the nature of that loan or credit. Similarly, it's useful to have surveyor instructions, so detailed instructions for surveyors on when to checkpoints for them to just check the logic of the questions before, or to communicate certain information to the respondent, assuring them of the confidentiality of the responses or soothing them. These are also really helpful to include in the main body of the survey. It's useful to have a grid structure to a lot of the surveys. If you're asking, for example, multiple respondents, this can help avoid errors, make the administration process of the survey a lot easier, and makes the data collection and entry process a lot faster as well. Just to give you an example from a JPAL survey, surveys basically include proper numbering. They include instructions in capital letters for surveyors on the side. There are clear numeric codes for every answer. This basically ensures that while entering the data, you're only entering a numeric code and not the entire textual answer. And there are clear skips and filters on the side, so surveyors know when to skip certain sections or questions of the survey. And finally, for a few tips and design resources, there are handouts that are being given out and are on the front desk, which have guidelines on designing and piloting from JPAL, IPA, and CLEAR, and a list of helpful books and papers, as well as literature reviews and survey questions from previous JPAL, IPA studies. So hopefully these will be useful. All the tables should have these papers. They should be on the tables.
Thank you,
That's
Diva.
the end of my presentation. Yeah.
Thank you, Diva, for familiarizing the audience with the basic concepts of instrument design. I will now open the floor to the audience in case they have any questions. I would like to request the audience to raise their hand, and when you are given the mic, then please introduce yourself and the organization you're from. We will take 2 or 3 questions at one time and then give the panelists a chance to respond to them.
I'm Ajit, Amaltash Consulting. And are there any norms about language? Should the questionnaire be in the same language that it's being administered in or not? And what are the norms about practices about this?
One thing I find when you mail questionnaires, the response numbers are usually around 20% and no more at best. Are there any tricks to ensure that you get a better number of responses and you actually get the critical mass you're looking for? Is there a magic number out there?
Do we need to translate the questionnaire while asking? Like the respondent is not understanding the question. So for the first instance, should we explain the questions or we should read the questionnaire as it is given in the questionnaire?
Okay, Diva, why don't you go ahead and answer these for now,
Sure.
and then we'll take another round of questions after
So
that.
there are 2 questions about language, which I'll address together. They're going to be explored in more detail in the second presentation, but a lot of the work around the language, which is often not, the questionnaire might be written by us in English and administered in Hindi or a local language in the Indian context. It requires a lot of piloting, translation, and what JPAL often does is a process of back translation as well. So translating back from the Hindi to the English to make sure that the translation is uniform and understood the same way in both languages. It involves a lot of piloting in the area to make sure that respondents, the right colloquial words are going to be used. And Harini is going to talk a lot more about this process in her second presentation.
Can you say a little bit more about how the back translation works? So you would go, say, from English to Hindi, and then a little bit more specifics on that?
So the translation process would go from English to Hindi, let's say, or to another local language. It would be piloted in the field to sort of tweak various words and get the right colloquial terms or make sure that respondents understand them in the same way. And it would also be back translated. So someone would translate it back from Hindi to English or from, let's say, Kannada to English to make sure that, the English version is in line with the local language. So this process of back translation basically helps the researchers and the research team check that the English version or the local version being used is in line with the English version.
So I just want to add a little bit of information to that. So typically when you want to do back translation, you'd also like it to be a blind back translation, in the sense that the person who's translating the local language does not actually know what is the English version of it. So that you as an audience can look at two different versions of the English questionnaire and compare and see if they're both actually consistent. And this is typically what we do in most of our JPAL projects.
And to order the mailing question, I don't have much experience with mail order questions, but I have a friend who's doing something similar right now. And it might be useful to give incentives, for example, for them to mail back. So there could be an incentive, assigned to filling the questionnaire. That's often something one has to do even during household visits or individual surveys to encourage people to fill out a timely questionnaire, for example. Or it could have some kind of encouraging message or, a sheet with it to give information on the value of the survey and the information they're providing. So those are two tips, but...
Are there any other questions?
I just want to add a little bit to the mail order thing. So typically when you want a certain number of surveys, the critical mass, you also have to be very aware of what is the response rate and ensure that you account for it when you're sending out these surveys. So if you want 1,000 surveys, you don't send out 1,000, you would have to send out 5,000 if your response rate is 20%. So it would be expensive, but this way at least you can ensure that you get the required number.
And piloting often helps with that. Piloting often helps with that process of understanding the response rate. So
I was regarding incentives that we were talking about. I was like, how ethical and advisable it is to add incentives to questionnaires. Your project might have that funds for which you give incentives. There'll be many other surveys which does not have it. So it becomes a trend kind of a thing. So the respondents to whom you carry out these kind of surveys, they always look for that whenever there's a kind of a survey, they'll get incentives. But when the other person comes for it, like we have experienced a lot in government, and that becomes a very bad trend for the different surveyors. So we have to be very cautious at that point of time. Yeah.
Hi, I'm Subhojit. I work with the development sector practice at KPMG India. I had a question about codes and questionnaires. Right. So when we do surveys, we don't do surveys in isolation, right? So there is the NSSO and there are multiple other organizations. There's the census. How important is it to try and adopt codes that are consistent with other large-scale surveys?
So I think if you're going to be comparing your data with other data sets, for example, in that case, I think uniformity is helpful. In any case, I think when you're drawing or making your instruments, it's always helpful to consult existing surveys or instruments in that area, but also add on some piloting and consulting with the program stakeholders, the beneficiaries, other experts in the area to make sure that your response codes are capturing all the necessary important information.
Sorry, just to add to the responses to this question, you also have to be careful of the issue of non-response error when you're sending out, a thousand questionnaires for and expecting back 200 answers. You have to measure for something called non-response error when you do that.
And there is selection bias.
Right.
Bias in who answers and who doesn't.
I want to ask question regarding the open-ended question. Because while analyzing these open-ended questions, it's very difficult to again code and then to analyze, because we don't know what type of response will be there. Because I want to share one example that in one of our studies, when we put open-ended questions, the respondents thought that they were not interested actually maybe in the survey, but still they left those open-ended questions, which were actually important questions, some of them. But still close-ended questions were all entered. Though they may be the knowing the answer, or they may have some answers, but they were not able to express in the open-ended questions. So is it advisable to add these open-ended questions, or to convert those open-ended into close-ended through some pilot, and then, I don't know, any solution?
I think it's important to pilot and understand your target audience and the respondents. I think open-ended questions are useful if you don't know what the answer codes are going to be. Like if you have no idea what the likely answers are, in that case, I think having an open-ended questionnaire is useful.
Okay.
But if you know what the likely answers are going to be, you want to make it easier for your respondents to mark them and easier for you to compare across respondents and analyze the data, then a close-ended approach is a lot more helpful.
So I just want to add a little bit to it. This is, looking back into what we did. So I was working on an education project, and we had a question which basically we wanted to know whether the teachers do anything while they are teaching in class to try and address the issue that some children just might not understand what they're teaching. Now, when you're working in government schools and we are not from those schools, and even after observation, we might not come up with a exhaustive list of things to choose from. So we actually ended up piloting this question pretty extensively for almost a month with about 4 or 5 people. So we ended up going to about 100 schools to understand for just this one particular question. And we realized that after a while, things starts converging to certain kinds of answers. So, and this is a very important question because we wanted to understand how teachers behaved in class. So it was well worth the effort for us to invest in a long-term pilot and get the answers.
We have time for the last 2 questions, and 1 question.
Hi, I'm Upneet. I work with the Water and Sanitation Program at the World Bank. My question is actually around ICT and using that for surveys, because I think compared with a few years back, we were doing surveys exclusively using pen and paper. Now we're switching over to sort of using initially PDAs and now mobile phones increasingly. And I was wondering if there's any experience around using mobile phones for surveys, and if you have any sort of information on comparing the costs and the time and the accuracy rates of different monitoring methodologies, paper versus PDA versus phone. Thanks.
It's a good question. Actually, our first roundtable dealt with digital data collection, so we talked a lot about mobile phones. And JPAL and CLEAR are now in the process of developing a knowledge product for digital data collection. So all the necessary information that one might need while considering this technology, so from costs to precautions to the different technologies that are available, the companies that are available, and the methods that you can use to build digital data collection into your M&E process. So it should be ready in a couple of weeks, so we'll be happy to share it with you. And we can always talk after the session to talk on more details.
Hi, I'm Suzanne Ross with USAID. Can you tell us a little bit about generalizability? Because ultimately we're looking at scale, and sometimes we'll do a survey in one area, and even though we think it's going to be replicable at 10,000 population or a million population, we find that isn't true. So how do you deal with generalizability with your studies?
So I think there's a trade-off in some ways, that you want to be able to make your survey as customizable to the population you're surveying to get an accurate picture of the details and the nuances that you're doing it. At the same time, you do want it to be comparable. So sort of what Suvajit was asking, when you're looking at these other instruments, mass instruments that are used, if you're planning on comparing your sample with these larger ones, then it might be useful to look at other existing instruments and the choices that they have and the data questions that they're asking.
Right. We'll take one last final question from...
No, my query was slightly different. It was that you mentioned something in your handout about making a SharePoint for your database of JPAL findings. So if we have to access what are the key findings, say you're working with government schools or health or whatever surveys you've done, so is there a kind of a source from which one can kind of see what are the key trends coming out from your surveys?
So some of our surveys, some of the databases are available on the JPAL website, but also what we have here, some of the handouts, maybe outside, not on the tables, are literature reviews. So they have a literature review of that particular topic and some questions which have been used in JPAL IPA surveys around the world. So I don't know if they're being handed out to all the participants, but they should be available on request.
So just a final comment on these 2 points that have been raised. So I think it's helpful to see that we are in this talking about structured surveys, and then structured surveys are very commonly a tool for kind of quantitative focused studies, and randomized control trials or randomized evaluations is one approach within that field. And I think what you're touching on is that you can get a very high degree of kind of internal validity, that this is the magnitude of this program in this context. And then the larger question, that kind of flows from these types of surveys and this whole type of approach to research is the external validity or the applicability in other contexts. And there's no silver bullet for that. I mean, I think that you have to, as Diva said, kind of be framing your questions so they would have relevance in other areas, or kind of running similar types of replicating your studies, running similar types of interventions in very different areas. So JPAL is increasingly focusing on that. We'll fund a whole initiative, say, for governance. They'll ask similar types of questions in different contexts, and that can kind of help overcome a little bit of the replicability. And then so on the results of the surveys, so increasingly, so we have shared like the template for credit. So we've got a lot of different questions there around financial inclusion and credit is one of the handouts. And I think in terms of like looking at the actual, what's the results of these surveys. So globally, JPAL has done over 300 evaluations. And so the results are summarized in 2-page summaries on our website, both by region and by sector. So if you look at the JPAL website under evaluations, you'll find those there. And then this is getting a little bit more broad, but there's also 3IE does a systematic review of evaluations, mostly all impact evaluations or quantitative evaluations from these types of structured survey, and that's also available on their website as 2 databases. So.
Okay, I'm sorry, but we don't have time for any more questions. I know a lot of you have many, so after the session is over, you can always just speak to the speakers then. Our next presentation is by Harini Kannan, and it is going to be on piloting. Harini's interest in evidence-based policy formulation influenced her decision to work with JPAL South Asia. She is currently working at JPAL South Asia as a research manager on the Haryana Education Project. This project attempts to evaluate the effect of introducing a new method of student assessment, continuous and comprehensive evaluation, as well as learning enhancement program on learning outcomes of students. Welcome, Harini.
Thank you. I'm really excited to see that a lot of people are asking questions about pretty much the nitty-gritties of questionnaire design, and in relation to that, really the aspect of piloting. So, just as Diva focused a lot on how to actually design a survey or a questionnaire, who to ask, why should we ask these questions, what sort of questions to ask, what I will focus on in this presentation is the art of piloting. So, what's piloting? So, the definition of piloting really varies depending on what phase of the piloting that you're talking about. in kind of the early phases, when you just have an idea of the subject that you want to do a survey on, it could take more of a participatory approach, something what Gita will talk about a little later. But it could be something having like small focus group discussions, talking to subject experts and talking to people who have experience building questionnaires and so on. While piloting, which a more familiar way that we use it is more in terms of taking out a semi-prepared questionnaire to the field and actually seeing how this works or tests in the field. Right? We want to do pretty much a trial run of this questionnaire. We also want to see how the surveyors actually ask these questions, get them to practice asking these questions, as well as, most importantly, to see whether we've missed anything. So sometimes we have a tendency where we talk amongst ourselves, discuss with the expert, or even sometimes go down and do focus group discussion, but it's always at a higher level, and we go down to the field and we realize that, oh no, we've forgotten these two important questions. And having a pilot before we do a large-scale rollout is really helpful to address these kind of issues. So I'm just going to give you a brief outline of what I'm going to cover today. The first is we'll talk about why is piloting important, what are the different steps involved in piloting, then how would you actually implement the pilot? This is more of the operational aspect of implementation. What are the things that you would look for in a pilot? Also kind of the questions which are really important and you want to discuss with your respondents. And again, going back to talking about the importance of language and translation. So it looks like a lot of you are interested, and I can share with you a lot more experiences that we had while we were doing this aspect of the piloting. And finally, importance of documentation and how this is a really iterative process, and how this feeds back into going and testing, having discussions, coming back, reworking, and going back and testing and piloting this questionnaire again. So the idea behind a pilot is really to find the best way or the optimal way to get all the information that you want in a timely manner as well as in a cost-effective manner. So typically when I start out creating a survey, it's usually about 10 pages. I'll have to cut down drastically because otherwise I'll make my respondent talk for 4 hours. So when you go on pilot, we also try to see what are the things that we absolutely really need and try to ensure that we can get this in an optimal manner. Sometimes you don't know who should answer these questions. So I'll give you an example from one of our projects. We were doing a project on the implementation of midday meal programs in government schools. So we decided that when we go to a primary school, typically most schools that we go to will be primary schools, the headmaster will have the most knowledge about the implementation of this program. This worked really well, and we were very happy with the answers. And then we started piloting in a high school or in a senior secondary school. It turns out the principal there really doesn't know much about this because they have a special person who's called the MDM in charge. So if we had not piloted this, we could have gone to a school and come back with really no information because we thought that, oh, it probably is not run well because the headmaster just didn't seem to know enough. So if you don't know who the respondent is, this is a good chance for you to figure out who the respondent should be by varying, the questions, by deciding to have different people answering these questions. Going back to what Diva said, it's also really important to think about how would you order your sections. So we can't have a section which talks about your health and then suddenly jumps to education and goes back to talking about health. So it has to have a certain flow. And when you are in the field, it's really important for you to check whether this flow is maintained. So talking to your respondent it's as if you're having a conversation, a very nice, detailed and informative conversation, but it has a flow. So the other things we talked about is again this notion of closed and open-ended, right? So we talked about to have having open-ended questions, analysis. When piloting it, it really helps you. It really helps you to fine-tune answers. Can I have the handheld mic? I think this is. Okay, I'm just going to continue this. Okay. I'm sorry. Finally, we also have to worry about the time taken. I think somebody was mentioning about how whether, can we have really long questionnaires with 200 options and so on. So it's really important that we ensure that this actually is something which is not too long. And it's very, very likely that the respondent would just get fatigued. It's not just a question of feeling tired and so on, but they just might be bored of answering the questions that you keep asking. Okay, so I'm just going to keep going. Okay. So I think we've covered quite a bit on the importance of piloting, and next I'll focus on really the steps in piloting. So you can think of piloting as something you'll do in a couple of phases. In the first phase, it really depends on what stage you are in terms of your idea and your survey. Sometimes it's just a question of knowing that, I have this thing I want to really learn about, so I'm going to figure out how to ask these questions. In this case, what you would do is you might just decide to go out to the field, have small focus group discussions, and come up with questions that you want to ask, right? So this is a virgin territory. You really just want to start off with asking questions. It could also be that you already have some idea of the questions you want to ask. You might be basing this on some previous surveys or previous studies and so on, in which case you can have a set of questions and go and ask those similar questions. Also ask related or new questions. Maybe try and understand whether those old questions work in this new context and try to adopt. Also learn a little bit about local terminologies, how would you translate certain words. So that's the kind of things you will do when you already have a semi-prepared questionnaire. What you'd always want to do is to ensure that you have enough time for a pilot. So typically we would start piloting a month or 2 months before we actually start our rollout, which will give us enough time to go back and forth. And this is for, when you already have some sort of a questionnaire in your hand. If you're just starting out new, I would suggest that give yourself enough time that you can go back and forth at least 4 or 5 times. So when you're also preparing the questionnaires, as Diva mentioned, you'll have a lot of questions which kind of build on other questions. So the question of how often you drive your car, it really depends on whether the person answered yes to I own a car. So when you have something like this, when you have to skip and so on, it is important for you to remember that these things are actually working. So when you're piloting, ensure that these skips actually are logically consistent. Because sometimes when you're sitting and preparing the questionnaire, you think they are, but they actually might not work the same way in the field. We also want, again, to get a sense of how long this would take. And if you feel that the respondent is getting tired, you again can think of maybe giving some sort of an incentive for the person to participate, or if it's a really long, so one of our projects was talking to patients. So sometimes the patients can't sit and talk to you for like an hour and a half. Maybe you can think of doing it as 2 surveys, maybe a follow-up survey. It really depends on what kind of data you want and whether giving a gap would affect your survey in any way. But that's something you can really think about. The second stage of piloting, this is more of the actual going to the field and field testing sort of a pilot. So in this pilot phase, what you would do is you would do it on a much larger scale. So you'll actually have a survey team for this, versus for the first stage, you might really not have. You could just be you and a couple of your colleagues going and doing these kind of focus group discussions and so on. But in this phase, you will have survey teams who will go out and who will do the surveys. This is also the phase you can really interact with your actual respondents or people who are as similar to your respondents as possible and get a final touches on translations and so on. Typically, when we also do our surveys and our questionnaires, we always have these notes, like how in Diva's presentations, we keep saying that this is what the surveyor should be doing, this is the instruction for them. This is also a time for you to see whether the instructions are actually ideal and working, or if you have to kind of rework them, revise them in any way. It is also really, really important that you keep it as close to the survey as possible, which not only means that the version that you're piloting is almost close to the finished product, it also means simulate a survey-like atmosphere, right? If your survey involves going and talking to mothers about nutritional practices at their homes, your piloting should involve people going to their homes and asking the mothers about nutritional practices. It should not involve asking mothers to come to a school or Anganwadi center and talking to them about these things. So that's the idea of a pilot. You're just trying to recreate similar environment and run through these questionnaires just as you would do in the real world. Again, this is more related to the actual workings of a pilot. I know this seems very obvious, but really, you have to plan a pilot very thoroughly. Take your time, sit down and think about the issues or the questions that you are a little iffy about. Because whenever I go pilot, I know that out of the 25 questions, there are about 5 questions I really, really need some kind of insight on. So I typically make notes on those questions and I put some extra effort to go and talk to my surveyors about the questions, probably talk to the respondents specifically about those questions and so on. It's also important that we find a population which is very, very close to the people that you're surveying. So suppose you have a survey on, say, contraceptive use in rural Haryana, you would try to go and pilot your questionnaire in a similarly rural area. You wouldn't go to Gurgaon and try to pilot it in that place. So you have to be very aware of that, because that piloting it in a non-representative population would really end up giving you a very different sort of a questionnaire than what you would want. The other thing is that you really have to train the surveyors, because at this point you're probably at a much larger field pilot stage, and it's not just you who are doing this survey. You want to really train your surveyors on how to do the survey, how to implement the survey, and also train these surveyors on trying to identify the issues or like hard spots. So it's not that they are just asking questions and you're sitting behind them observing and trying to get the hard spots, but also actually training them on and telling them that this might be a tricky question. Try to see what, if there's another way you can get the respondents to answer this question and so on. So training on that is also equally important. The next few things are really kind of protocols that's advisable to follow. So just as I said before, when you have a completely new questionnaire, which is something that you have developed, it's best to go and pilot it at least 30 or 40 times. So this would mean that if you're working with a group of, say, 5 surveyors, you go and talk to about 6 to 10 respondents each, so that you have enough of a variation in that sample so that you can get a good instrument out of it. If you're recycling old questions, which is, we had, for some of our surveys, we actually took from another survey in Bihar and we used some questions of that in Haryana. In that case, those are in some sense tested, but you still want to go and pilot it because something which is valid in Bihar might not really be applicable in Haryana. So you want to go and pilot it in any case. So it's never advisable to take a survey and just go to large-scale surveying without piloting it in between. Also, what is important is any time you add a new question, and this is quite likely, if you have surveys which are going on, especially some sort of like monitoring surveys and so on, which is going on for months on end, there might be something new which has happened which wasn't there when you started the survey and you want to learn about. In that case, it's not advisable to just add those 2 questions that you want to know and send out the survey, but actually spend time piloting those 2 things and going back and including them in the final version of the survey. So sometimes you'll be really, really lucky to find a respondent who's willing to sit and chat with you. Please make use of that respondent and try to see if, go through the entire survey with him and also try and talk to him or her and see if they have any insights into asking kind of different questions. So typically these will be people who are actually from that village or ward or slum and so on. So having their knowledge and input into your questionnaire would be really helpful. So finally, it's very likely that you will not be piloting this yourself. You will be sending out surveyors and your other field staff. You have to train them in such a way and give them clear enough instructions that they don't make assumptions about the questions themselves. So if there's a question and there's no clear instructions and you don't want the surveyor to on the fly think of, oh, this must be the way this question should be asked, and ask that question. And this is also something which you really want to keep an eye on while you are doing it, because we've seen it. We have a few surveyors, cocky, overconfident surveyors. Oh, we've done this a million times. And they're the ones who make mistakes, because they just kind of assume that I know how to ask this question. And we have to really guard against something like that. So what are things to look for in a pilot? So comprehension and order of questions, this is something I'll go over in detail with a few examples. But the other things are things like variations in responses. So we had Diva who talked about, having enough options so that people choose different options, but not having too broad options that nobody chooses many of the options. So in this case, when looking at a pilot, you would want to see whether you have all the options. If you have missing options, please include them. So we had an instance where we went for the MDM survey. We asked them, what are the things you buy on a weekly basis? And they said everything, but we had missed out salt, right? So we included salt because it's easier to include that and pre-code it, because a lot of respondents say they use salt, rather than having them enter it as an other item. So this is also a chance for you to trim your questionnaire, cut it short. Or if you think you need more questions in there, add those questions depending on what you found. So also a chance for you to see whether the respondents get tired, and in any manner in which you want to address that. Also, again, going back to this notion of having friendly formats, we have people who are using paper surveys. So one time what we ended up doing was we sent out a survey which was in a landscape format. And one of the biggest feedback we got from our surveyors was that, no, this is very unwieldy, give it to us in a portrait format. And we actually followed it. And remember that in the end, you want to kind of ensure that the surveyors are actually comfortable with your survey, because their comfort has a lot to do with the kind of questions they will ask and the kind of output you will get from them. Similarly, we talked about digital data survey. So another thing I want to talk to you specifically about digital data is that you have to test out the software a lot. So it's not something, don't accept the first product, keep testing it, go back and see what will happen. You have to check about, server capacity, a lot of things, and I'm sure there'll be a lot to talk about when the product comes out. But that's something we want to think about during the piloting phase itself. So a few examples. So this again goes back to one of the projects that I was working on. The government of Haryana has introduced this new policy where the teachers would evaluate students on a more regular basis. And we evaluate these students as well as record whatever the evaluation is in this special sheets called student evaluation sheets. So we wanted to know whether the teachers are actually using these sheets. So we tried to ask these questions. Do you use the evaluation sheet in your school? And the answers were yes, no, I don't know, I'm not sure, and there's no response. So we got a lot of don't know, not sure, and we don't know what's happening. Is it because they don't understand? Is it because they don't know what evaluation sheet is? It is called something else. So what we then tried to do was we carried a sample of that evaluation sheet with us, and then we asked them, do you have these sheets with you? And then they would say, oh yeah, we have these sheets, but they might be calling it something else. And then we ask them, have you been actually trained on how to use these sheets? Yes, we've been trained. Do you use them? Oh no, I don't use them, it's too difficult. So the wealth of knowledge you get from those 3 questions is very different from what you would get from just that one question. Even though you might think that they're actually kind of addressing and looking for the same kind of answers. So this is something it would be really helpful in a pilot for you to look into. The other thing is notion of ordering and priming, right? So look at these 3 questions. The first question says, yesterday, how much time did you spend cooking, cleaning, playing with your child, teaching, or doing homework with your child? The second says, do you think it's important for mothers to play with children? The third says, do you think mothers or fathers should be more responsible for a child's education? So what do you think would have happened if we had flipped these questions around? So you can see that there is kind of a ordering to these questions, right? We had Diva who talked about, we'll ask factual question first, then we'll go to attitudinal and behavioral sort of questions. The first question is very factual. We're asking how many hours did you spend, right? Or how much time, and the answers would be probably in hours and minutes. If we had flipped these questions around and asked question 2 and then 3 and then 1, you're almost trying to tell the person that, oh, you know, you kind of have, it's your responsibility that your child should be studying, or you really have to play with your child, which might have led to the third question being answered with an overestimate of the time they spent doing these activities. So a good way of testing this is to try different versions of the question with different orderings of these questions and see if there's a systematic way in which these answers differ because of the orders of the question. Again, we'll touch a little bit about the translation and language. I'm not going to talk too much about the back translation part of it, but I'll address some of the other questions we had. The first thing is, I guess most of us are creating the questionnaire in English or maybe any other native language that you're used to. And typically, it's then translated into the language of the respondents. So we learned it the hard way that sometimes the respondents, the language of the responses may not be the official or the Shuddha Bhasha. So we had a survey which we had translated into very official, proper Hindi, and we went and spoke to the headmasters with that particular survey. Turns out half the headmasters actually did not understand what we were asking because it was just too difficult. So we had to end up using local variations of the language or just simplifying the language. So a lot of our surveys these days are actually in Hinglish. It's not even in Hindi anymore. Because we found that for some of the words, people are much more familiar with the English versions rather than their Hindi versions. For example, we wanted to ask the question that, do school monitors provide you with any feedback? And we used the feedback word in Hindi and nobody understood it. Then when we asked them saying that, aapke school monitors aapko kya feedback dete hain? Then immediately we had responses. Because people understood the word feedback more than the other word. So we had a question on whether we have to actually translate it so that you can read it out. So our advice is to say yes, because if your survey is in English and you have 10 surveyors, it's very likely that the surveyors will translate it in 10 different ways, which will end up giving you slightly different answers, and you do not want that. On a related note, it is perfectly okay for the surveyor to initially, when they start off, read out the question from their surveys. What we will try to do is to try to go to a point where it's almost like a structured conversation and they don't have to keep referring to the survey at every single point. But that will come only with a lot of practice. So initially, we have to look at the surveys. We have to ensure that they follow everything as required, as instructed to them in those surveys. Finally, documentation and feedback. So all this effort really comes to naught if you don't have documentation on what happened. So as you've seen, this is a very iterative process. So at every point, it's really important that we note down, what has happened, what were the respondents thinking about, how are the surveyors behaving. Maybe your surveyors just need a lot more training. What you have given them is not enough. And these are things which will come up in the pilot, and you need to record these somewhere. So one of the practices that we have adopted in our piloting is to pilot in groups of 2. So one person will actually administer the questionnaire, while the other person will sit and note down, what was happening there. Is the surveyor unable to explain this question? Is the respondent confused about the wording of a certain question? What sort of an atmosphere is this? Is this something they have to change? Do you think that having a survey in the middle of the field in a school is not appropriate? Maybe we should office room or an empty classroom. So just things like that. You also have to have a lot of meetings where you can share your inputs. So it's not that the surveyors will come back to you one-on-one and can give you the inputs. It's ideal to sit down and talk with all your field members, go back and share it with your other team members, come back, revise, pilot, and so on. Also advisable is to keep different versions of the questionnaires with you, because you will be going over multiple revisions and you want to see kind of, how the questions have evolved over time. And your documentation will also give you a rationale as to why you moved from version 1 to version 8. So this is pretty much where I would like to stop and I guess open the floor for any questions that you have on questionnaire design as well as piloting. Thank you.
Thank you, Harini. Before I open the floor to questions, I'd just like to remind everyone that you have each been given a feedback form, so if you could please fill that and at the end of the session drop it off at the registration desk. Okay. Are there any questions? We follow the same format as previously. We take 2 or 3 at a time and then the...
Nimrat, Azim Premji Foundation. So I was just wondering, you've emphasized rightly the importance of training surveyors during your presentation. And I guess the pilot is also one way of ensuring that they've understood what is expected of them. I was just wondering if it would be possible for you to share how you approach the training in brief. I'm sure it's and whether there are any commonalities in different surveys, etc. Thank you.
My question is quite related to this. So I'm an independent consultant, but I majorly work with RED training, and I consult with various nonprofits also. So my question is that any particular skill set which is required of the surveyors, and then of course a little bit on how to train them so that there's objectivity in all their performance. Thank you.
Okay, Harini, you can... Okay.
Yeah, my name is Dushyant Badal. I am from CMS. My question is that related to that, what are the minimum numbers of the respondent ideally required for the piloting process? First thing is that. The second thing is that quite related to this, what do you suggest who should involve in the piloting process other than the core team members?
So I'll try to address all these questions. So typically we'll have a training process. So it depends really on how long your survey is and how difficult your survey is. So for some of the surveys for us which involves one-on-one student testing, we typically train our surveyors for at least 6 days, out of which we are on the field doing field practice sessions for about 3 days. And then we do a full-scale practice for maybe a day or two. And since this involves about 35-40 surveyors, that's a pretty large practice session. So I would say that when you are actually piloting and you're piloting as well as when you are actually doing the survey, especially in your piloting, you have to have kind of a mixed bag of surveyors. Typically you would like to choose your best surveyors and pilot with them, but remember that they're not very representative of all your surveyors. So it will be ideal for you to have like a mixed group of people and try to see how they respond to different scenarios, how well are they in picking up these questions and so on. And I cannot overemphasize the importance of training. Train people a lot. Also have a strong enough monitoring team in the field while the survey is actually happening, who are constantly doing random visits and so on. So I'm sure I think the next roundtable involves survey team management and stuff like that, and we'll go over much more in detail about that specific aspect. But it's not a question of just training them and turning them loose. It's a question of constant monitoring and feedback. And we've had times when we've called everybody back on a Sunday and said, no, you guys are terrible. We have to do another 2 days of training. So it's very, very likely. So I guess the other part was on the respondents. I'm sorry, could you just repeat that question on the respondents?
How many respondents ideally is required for the piloting process? First thing is that. And related to that also, I need to know that whom we can involve in that piloting process, other than that core team members. So
I'll answer your second question first. So typically what we do when we do a pilot is, we'll have the research associate or someone who's, the person who's primarily responsible for designing the questionnaire. We'll also have our field manager. We will have a couple of our monitors and about 5-6 of our surveyors. The surveyors, the people who are actually going to administer the survey in the field. And the responsibility is also kind of different for different sorts of people. So the surveyors will be actually looking at administering the questionnaires, while the monitors will be looking for issues of both the respondents as well as the surveyors, as well as, feasibility study on how we can do this on a large scale and so on. So a pilot, it's really important that you have some kind of representation of the different levels of people who will be involved in the final survey, so that everybody kind of understands the process, because it's also important for a monitor who's going to monitor these people to understand this entire process as well. So the first question, it really depends. So now if you have a kind of like a homogeneous population, someone, and you go and maybe you can pilot it, as we said earlier, 30, 40 times, you get respondents, it's fine. But if you're going to do a much more difficult sort of an exercise question, like for example in us, when I talked about this open-ended question, which we had to then make closed-ended, we actually piloted that for over a month with 4 or 5 people. So that was a lot of responses, and that was really necessary because it was something we really had no clue about, and we wanted as many responses as we could get. So it really depends on how comfortable you are with those questions and where you'll need more inputs.
So Harini, real quick, can I ask you just a follow-up question? And so now we're at JPAL, we're trying to build up our monitoring and evaluation system. So in each of the research programs that we do, it's the same types of processes that be across all of the projects. So on training, how long, so for an average survey of however many pages, you can let us know how many pages the average surveys you've been working on have been. How long do you train? And then what are some of the, both in training and when you do the piloting, what are some of the common pitfalls that you see, these types of mistakes that happen kind of over and over, that you kind of monitor, those risks that you monitor in both those things?
So as I said, typically for our survey, we train our monitors for about 6 days. So our survey involves a very short survey, which is administered to the headmaster of a school. Then we have a longer survey which is administered for the child, where it's a one-on-one testing. If any of you are familiar with the USR assessment tool, it's pretty much that what we use. We also have a longer written test for the children, but in that case the surveyors have less to do then. They just have to talk about giving out certain instruction at certain specified intervals of time and so on. But I also know that there are some of the other surveys where they had a lot of testing, testing for anemia and so on, where they've trained for at least 3 weeks. So it really depends on how difficult your questionnaire is, and also how good your surveyors are in some sense, so that they can catch on quickly and you can do. So the other related thing is, what kind of pitfalls that you look for. So I think some of the things that we want to look at is sometimes the surveyor kind of gets the sense that, yes, I know the survey well, and there's a sense of overconfidence in some sense, and we need to stop and say no, because sometimes what happens is that they hold the survey in their hand, but they're asking all those questions, and they might jump to a question which comes much later, but they're talking about it just because they think, oh, we've already started talking about this, let's talk about this as well. No, that's not okay. You can elaborate on the questions a little bit, but you have to stick to the order that is prescribed in the survey. So that is something which you really have to keep an eye out for when you're doing your pilot. And the other things when you're doing a pilot is much more mechanical. Are they, choosing the correct options? And in JPAL, we follow the system that we actually circle all the options and not tick them, because a tick is quite easy to misinterpret. You might have a scratch and might think that is an option which was chosen, and probably not. So we actually circle. So then we ensure, because sometimes when they first start off, the tendency to just tick, and we say, no, stop, you have to circle these things. And we pay a lot of attention, especially when you have these skip pattern things, which are much more kind of difficult questionnaires, and we have a lot of skip patterns, and we pay a lot of attention there, because sometimes the person might not understand the skip pattern, and they'll ask questions which are really not applicable. So these are kind of the areas where we really focus on.
I have a question. I'm Sangeeta from PHFI. I was like, what if during piloting you come to know that you have landed up into wrong respondent? What to do in that case?
So I just want a little clarification.
Yeah, to add more on to that, like the list that was given to you for the survey, you had the list of, let's say, primary medical officers. You have sampled them and then you went for piloting. Now you came to know when you actually go into the field, these people have been given additional or other responsibilities, or let's say they've been made in charge of it. So their role completely gets changed. So what to do in that case?
Okay, this is an excellent question because we actually face this quite a bit. We go to schools and we want to talk to the headmaster, and the headmaster is not around, and we don't know where the headmaster is. So what we typically do is we have the first question which says, "What is your designation?" And if they say that I'm an in charge, if I'm a medical officer but I'm an in charge, we choose that. And all our analysis is conditional on the fact that they are an in charge and they're not the actual person. So we know from the beginning that we might not be able to rely on this information really well just because they're not the exact person this was addressed to.
Remove them from the sample?
No, we won't remove them. We will still include them. But we will say that, okay, we'll have this variable covariate saying that these people are in charges. They're not headmasters, but they're in charge of a school who are not headmasters.
What if the size is more than 50%? What if you get the number of respondents more than 50% of these kinds?
So again, this is what you must have gone when you're piloting to find out this kind of things, right? So for us, it's more a question of the headmaster should be there, but is not there for whatever reason. But in your case, it seems to be a more systemic problem where people are not around. So this is something which should have been addressed during the piloting phase or even pre-pilot, where you're going to have focus group discussions and you talk to them and see that, oh, this is a scenario. Then you ask a few more questions which will help you to understand their roles and so on.
But then you'll not change your questionnaires.
Well, if it's necessary, we'll have to scrap the whole thing and start from the beginning. Yeah.
I just wanted to add that in addition to training surveyors, it's also important to think about how you constitute and select your survey team in a lot of these cases. Some of these are large-scale studies which use 100 to 200 surveyors, and it's good to have a screening process before your training and even during your training to ensure the quality of your field team. So piloting also helps a lot in understanding the requirements that are needed from your surveyor and from your field team, and the process of supervision or back-checking or quality checks that are needed. We have time for a final round of questions, so could you go first and then you?
I'm Urvashi from Catalyst Management Services. Sort of in connection to her question, actually, one of the things that I've seen is in a lot of places when you're going to interview, let's say, the headmaster or the sarpanch in a particular gram panchayat, the person you'll find usually, especially if it's a reserved for women constituency, is the sarpanch pati or the husband, or like even in schools we've gone where the headmaster is actually a woman and her husband is overseeing the running of the schools in a lot of places. So like, what is the protocol to be followed there, and how can you incorporate that into the pilot study so you know where these issues might come up?
So, one of the things that when we were doing this MDM study was something related. We had a module where you had to speak to the SMC member, and whenever there was a female SMC member, we found that she was sitting in a gungat and she used to lift her gungat and signal to someone else, and somebody else answered. So one of the ways to mitigate this is to very firmly tell the person that no, we want to talk to this person in private. SMC is School Management Committee. So you can say that no, I want to speak to the headmaster in private, and if it's an issue of gender and so on, maybe you can send a female surveyor and have them talk to them in private. This is actually something which we advise for almost anything, because sometimes you'll have a group mentality and the answer they would say is biased because you're sitting in a group and so on. So that's something which you really have to be careful about. So
I just wanted to add that this is exactly the kind of problem you don't want to run in when you roll out your survey with like 10,000 villages or households or whatever. So the pilot is important in establishing what the condition is on the field and what the reality is, and making sure your instrument addresses it beforehand.
So one thing I want to add to that is, so we had this another survey where we wanted to go and observe a teacher who was teaching in class. And when we piloted it, we found that half the time the teachers are not in class. So in that case, what observation do we do? And then we used to nudge the teacher and go get them to the class and so on. So we always add another question at the end of it, like, did you have to make the teacher go to class? So then we know that all our data is conditioned on the fact that that person was forced to go into the class, which would have changed the behavior than he would have done normally. So having those kind of qualifiers and so on would help. So in your case, you can say that after you talk to the person, you can say that, oh, was she alone talking with you, or was there somebody else sitting with you, and so on. But as Diva said, this is exactly something which you want to think of when you're piloting.
Yeah, in addition to that question, in case if we are having an evaluation in a facility-based survey, and this survey is across to around 200 points geographically in around 20-40 districts across to 4 or 5. What is the criteria for piloting our evaluation? So, or assessment kind of thing. What is the criteria?
So you're saying that you have
facility-based survey basically.
Yeah, so facility-based, and you have 250 facilities across a widespread.
6-7 state kind of.
Yeah, so I would say that you would probably have to pilot in small number of PSCs in every state, because it's also important that you have the translation right, and sometimes the local context might be slightly different in one state than the other. Maybe the facility is based in a certain different type of administrative unit, or so on and so forth. So you will have certain themes of questions, and you will have to pilot enough number of times in all the states, just because of the rather large variation. So I'll give you another example. Is when we were doing the survey in 2 districts in Haryana, we found that one district was closer to Punjab, and the words they used in that district was not something which they used in the other district, was closer to Rajasthan. So we knew this only because we piloted extensively in both areas.
Like in any survey, we have a main respondents, right? But apart from that, we also interview with the higher authority, maybe just to have an overview of their project or their activity. So should that interview questionnaire need to be also be pilot tested, because maybe only the one respondent is there. So is it?
Yes, definitely. So you would want to test any sort of questionnaire or survey that you are going out in the field with. So this headmaster survey that I was talking about, we have a sample of 400 schools, and there are only 400 respondents, but we piloted that for about 2 weeks before we got it. We were happy with the outcome. While the tests itself were administered to about 12,000 children, and we actually didn't pilot it as much because it was a pretty well-established test, but we still piloted it to ensure that it was applicable to the local context. So anything you go out in the field and you want people to respond to should be piloted.
Okay, I'm sorry, we don't have time for any more questions, but we can always continue this discussion offline. It is time now for our final presentation. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our next speaker, Gita Gopal. Gita will speak about the participatory approach to designing a survey instrument. Gita is a social development professional with more than 20 years of experience at the World Bank in Washington. She has worked with participatory approaches in many parts of the developing world. After taking early retirement from the World Bank in November 2009, she has been working on a voluntary basis as a gender director with Janasree Sustainable Development Mission. It is a grassroots organization with more than 65,000 self-help groups in Kerala. Welcome, Gita.
Thank you very much, Shri. I would first like to thank Clear, John and Diva for having organized for us to come here and share the Janasree experience with all of you. I'd like to ask you, how many of you have been involved in participatory research? I'm sure all of you have been in some form or the other. So I do wonder if I'm carrying coal to Newcastle, but nevertheless we'll tell you a little bit about what we did. I'd also like to acknowledge the contribution of Clear. I mean, with this kind of experience, we were really benefited from that experience in developing this process, in developing the instrument. Neha, who I must mention from Clear, who's not here anymore but has gone off to the United States, really helped us through the process. We also partnered with the planning board, the Kerala Planning Board, and that was extremely good because we are also trying to influence policy on gender equality in Kerala. I'm hoping to very briefly give you an introduction, a background as to why we are doing this, why did we select participatory approaches, talk a little bit about the planning stages, developing the survey instrument and the risks and challenges, and a slide perhaps on what happened at the end of it. Janasree is a grassroots organization. As Shri said, 65,000 grassroots organizations. When I went to them in November of 2009. These are all self-registered. Most of them are supposed to consist of 10 women and 10 men, little different from the usual self-help groups, which consist mostly of women. Broad objectives, sustainable and eco-friendly development, and Janasree links with SHGs, links the self-help groups with private and public sector. What is gender equality in Kerala? This was a little bit shocking to me when I came in, because I had read of Amartya Sen, who had spoken about the Kerala model of development, etc. And yes, there are high levels of education and the health status is very good. But I wonder if any of you knew how many out of the 20 MPs from Kerala are women. Any guesses? Siddharth? No? Aparna? How many? Is there one right now? I think in the Lok Sabha, in the Rajya Sabha, in the Lok Sabha, I don't think there's anybody at the, in Lok Sabha. Yeah. Okay, 0. I think if I checked, and I think it's 0. So think of Kerala. Think what percentage of the women in Kerala do you think have control over some of their own resources? Compare Kerala with Karnataka, what would you guess? I think I at least assumed that in Kerala we'd have much more control over our own resources. But Kerala has half, at least in a survey undertaken in 2006, the National Family Health Survey, they found out that only 22% had actually control over resources, while in Karnataka and in Tamil Nadu it was double and triple, and the national average was 44%. So I'm afraid there is a great deal for Kerala to move forward, and yet there is a reluctance to accept that this is the situation. And government dialogue still seems to be stuck in a kind of women and development approach. So this was what I first joined Janasree to look at. But when I joined them and asked them for what kind of information do you have, there was only very little anecdotal information. There was really no information. Just they told me that there are 65,000 groups working, nothing very much. So there was immediately a need for assessing results for better programs and resource allocations. I visited some of the Janasree groups and I noticed that there were several good results that were coming out of them. So there was a need to celebrate the positive progress that they had made, and also to enhance the accountability of these self-help groups. Because with 65,000 groups, centralized accountability is extremely difficult, and there needs to be accountability at that level. And one way we could do it, I believed, was through a monitoring and monitoring system is assigned there. The good part about Janasree was that we had some very good leaders. They were committed to this. So they gave me a carte blanche to no money, nothing, 0 from them, because they don't have that kind of money to set up a monitoring. So the objectives were to design and pilot a gender-aware monitoring system at the grassroots level, formally introduce a gender equality approach to, as well as make the system gender aware, and influence policy makers in Kerala to shift towards gender equality and gender mainstreaming. These were our objectives. Now, why did we select a participatory approach? One was we felt that given the lack of resources, but the wealth of human resources, the ability to establish a participatory monitoring system would perhaps also help to build capacity, would increase accountability, as I mentioned it, and would also help learning at the grassroots levels amongst these groups of people as to what was working well and what was not working well. Comparative advantage of Janasree's was the structure was there, 65,000 groups to work with. So that was a big advantage. And as I mentioned to you, commitment from the top management. Why a pilot? I don't think I need to speak more about that. Harini has spoken very eloquently about that, and a lot of information for us. One thing for us was cost effectiveness also that we wanted to look at. How much would this pilot actually cost? Would these people monitor, and with these self-help groups monitor without incentives, as you said, because if we establish those incentives, then at 65,000 groups, it would not be possible. It would not be sustainable. So therefore, it was essentially very important that we test out a pilot, and hopefully through a pilot of 1 year long, we are hoping also to encourage people, because they will suddenly realize this information is very helpful. They're already starting to realize it from our testing of the questionnaires as to what exactly what kind of information will be coming, and how they will be able to actually assess where they have done well and where they have not done well. Now, given the situation of gender equality in Kerala, I think immediately I realized that whatever we said had to be evidence-based, because there is a feeling that gender equality is all very well in Kerala, and there's nothing much to do about it. So the first thing was to do a diagnostic, because you need to convince the people, and data was difficult to get. As I told you, I'm citing a 2006 survey, and I'm always told in most meetings that I go to, oh, you've got 2006 information, we are much better now. So I don't know, maybe they are better, maybe it is better now, but I have no idea. Adapting the knowledge, because especially when they're told that I've come from 20 years of, especially 20 years of working in the World Bank, the immediate assumption is that I'm an American. I'm coming in with instructions from America to establish. In fact, it came up so often I had to explain to them, but the precautions we took was adapting the knowledge to self-help groups. For this, as she was talking about, we went several times to many self-help groups to exactly understand what they were working and what were the results they were looking for. So from that, we tried to develop case studies which were rooted in Janasree activities. Applying the learning, you must remember we are taking 54 participants, 54 people from Janasree grassroots leadership. Being Kerala, they're all educated, almost all had a graduate degree, or many of them had a master's degree, many of them were trainers for grassroots. So we had a good pool of people, but we were bringing them in, perhaps in many of them were 40s and 50s, so they had left school long ago, and therefore we had to encourage them to learn actually, and therefore we tried to apply. It was actually Clear's idea to try, and Neha's idea actually, to try and apply what they are learning during the workshops itself with Sangam groups, and to test out if they are understanding the new concepts, etc. They were also, in the process of dialogue with them, I also realized that we were generating new knowledge about what was happening in the grassroots. So we also tried to capture that to the extent possible. It was a participatory process. Organizing the workshop, selection of the participants was extremely important, because we were not going to give them incentives to do this monitoring, so we had to look to select the committed ones. And there is, as you know, in Kerala, a lot of politics about this, so we managed sometimes, we didn't manage always. Selection of facilitators and trainers was also important, because we needed people to be on the same concept. We could not have someone talking about a women in development approach, someone else talking about a gender equality approach, because as you know, these are different and you cannot afford to confuse them. The next thing was the selection of partners, because being a participatory process, often partners, and I know when I was in the bank, not in all cases, but in some cases we have fixed views and we want them to do that, and we believe that's the right way to do. So the selection of partner was very important, and I must thank John, Diva, Neha, all of them, because they went along with us. They realized that there's got to be some trade-offs here, and so that was extremely important for us. Now, the whole process was a rather lengthy process. We started looking at this gender equality quite some time back. I think I turned to John in December of 2000 of last year, and so from a situation where we had just anecdotal information, we're just at the end of the phase 1 of the pilot. We haven't really started the main pilot. There was a 2-day planning workshop. Planning is extremely important, because even a participatory thing, if you have not planned, then you're really going to get lost. Even when you've planned, many of those plans can't be implemented, because people come in and want to do things differently, and unless you do it the way the majority wants it done, I mean, it's not really participatory. So therefore, there was a 2-day planning workshop first to get everybody together to help get the commonality in language and to get everybody onto the same page. We mostly focused on gender equality, its differences with the women in development approach and a main gender and development approach, as well as talk to them about, and Clear was again helpful in this regard, in talking about the change theory and the inputs, the outputs, the outcomes. We stopped at the outcomes. So that was the 2-day. Then the 5-day workshop was actually bringing 55 participants, including 14 from the planning board, because we thought those will be able to have much more technical experience, and indeed they did. We had 2 at each table of 10, I think it was, and the Janasree participants, so that they could exchange information and the planning board could kind of mentor these people. That was a period of 5 days. That's all we had. And as Harini said, training is extremely important. We had 5 days, but we had to communicate to them the concept of gender equality, the concept of monitoring, the change theory, and we also focused on focus group discussions, as well as give them time to be able to apply that with Sangams around the Trivandrum area. So that was a 5-day workshop. Then there was, through that workshop, there was a development of a pilot draft survey. Then the participants tested that instrument with on the morning of the last day of the 5-day workshop. Actually, we took them to different Sangam groups. They tested, they came back, and they discussed it with us, said what worked in their view, what people were not, questions that people did not want to answer, questions that turned off people, and then it was revised again. Then these participants went back to their districts, selected 5, we didn't particularly say randomly or anything, select 5 from each one had certain Janasree groups under their head. So select 5 of 5 groups and speak to those 5 groups, fill up the survey instruments in talking to them and bring them back to us. So these people, they also had another task. They had to talk to them about gender equality. What do these people think of gender equality? Do they think gender equality is important, or are they happy? Do they think gender equality is a problem for development? So that was one kind of 3 questions they were given to us, plus the remaining survey instrument to fill. Again, they came back for another 2-day workshop where they then, as groups, provided us feedback on what worked, what did not, exchanged information, because these are from different parts of Kerala, and so there are fairly major differences. They discussed it amongst them and then came up with a draft survey instrument. We also discussed the draft survey instrument once again with about 30 groups or sangams with the women, made them actually fill it up so that we could see if they could do it early, if they could do it clearly. It was clear that our form was perhaps a little too complicated, so we again talked to the leaders and reduce the complexity. I'm not sure we've managed to reduce adequate complexity, but we have started the first pilot in 25 groups in Kerala. We've just got the information back, and we are finding that a lot of things, like Sri said, I think tick instead of the actual coding, etc. So we've now got to go back to them. We have 2 more workshops to ensure how best to do that, and then probably pilot. We plan to actually go to the main pilot, which is 750 sangams all over Kerala. Now, the most difficult thing for us was to create the framework, for the monitoring framework. We had to tell them about a gender equality framework. We had to talk to them about the theory of change, and then fit these 2 into the agency's mandate. So there had to be a lot of hand-holding in this regard, but we did it in a very iterative manner, and I think I will come to that. We did it in a very interactive and iterative manner. None of us imposed our views. I mean, we got statements like, so what, what is wrong in beating a wife once in a way? Now, if this came only from men, I would have said, oh, but women said, we don't mind being beaten once in a way. And actually, the 2006 survey says that 65% of the men, and in many other states in India actually think it's okay to to use violence with a cause. And the cause is that when you ignore your in-laws or when you don't look after the children. And I think it was 65% of women who say that it's okay, and thank God only 55% of the men say that it's okay. So you're dealing with that kind of a resistance in many cases. So from in the beginning, on the first day, from being told that we don't want to measure this because you're coming to create problems for our families. You're going to break up families. That's what you're going to do. We had to convince them that it was not a women and development approach or a women's only focus, that we were going to focus both on men and on women. And there are very clear male gender issues in Kerala. There is education. 70% of the graduate and 80% of the postgraduate students are women. Alcohol drinking, highest per capita in the country. Suicides. 75% of those who commit suicide are men. So through the 5-day discussion, we got them gradually. If there were 50, 56 people, I'm not talking of the planning board because they were more convinced. 56 people, I think we got about 40 plus onto our side. So it was constantly interactive. So we gave them problems throughout. They would do the problems, come back with outlining the inputs, the outputs, and the outcome. Then they'd go back. We discuss this amongst us, criticize, each group would critique the other person's thing. Then they would go back, they would come back with indicators. Then we would tell them about the tests for indicators. They would do that. So it was really an iterative process through which they learned rather than us kind of top-down telling them. We also had a very good trainer who strengthened their focus group discussions because they would go back and they'd have had to fill those forms. So we thought some clear. Now, many of them had done group discussions, but they all found focus group discussions extremely helpful because they were doing this, but without really being trained in it. So they found that extremely interesting. Based on that, we developed the instrument, which, as you can see, we had background, and we had Neha's help in this and Diva's help from far. Background information, progress and views on gender equality. We had the economic progress, the income, savings, and the borrowing, which was very easy because they have it and they know it. It's in their registers, so they have to fill it, and it's almost always the same for most people. And then the more difficult ones about alcohol, gender, dowry, and training and skills acquisition. Now, the instrument I will not talk about because everybody else has really spoken about it, but I think I want to emphasize the point that it is extremely important in a participatory process to identify relevant dimensions and indicators. That's nothing new, but when you do it in a participatory way, it takes a long time. So it has to be, you can't say I'm going to do it in half a day. It's not possible. We took us the 5-day workshop, the 2-day workshop, etc. to come up with this. Responsibilities is important. And that was another problem. How do we do it? The costs of collection also, as I mentioned to you earlier, become a very important point. Now in phase 1, we plan to move forward to 750 groups. We're still asking questions like the coding, was it too difficult? Because they came back, they didn't know codings. The final format, if you remember, Diva, was for 3 years, so that the same document could be used by the same member. That turned out to be too complicated because they had the coding numbers and then they had 1, 2, 3 for the years, so they didn't know where to do what. So we're going to do 2 more workshops actually to discuss the instrument before we move on. We have the advantage that we are using the best of the ones that we trained to actually monitor this process. So we will bring them back to two of the workshops and train them. And of course, this has to be, when you're working with someone like Janasree and with most people, it has to be a continuous process of capacity building. And often because of the way the NGO works, we cannot all the time select the same people because they'll say, what is this? We're not getting trained. So we did our best to appoint 28 people from those that we trained who were extremely committed and wanted to go on with this as gender monitors. You must remember and appreciate that they are doing it for virtually nothing. If they get their expenses covered, that would be very good. Now, what do I have to say very quickly? I think participation is extremely tedious. Those of you who have been there must know. It takes time. And especially as in all institutions, even like in the World Bank, where the president is extremely committed to gender equality or to monitoring, at the mid-level, particularly to gender equality, you find strong resistance. And I found that here. We have 14 district heads of Janasree, all male. I probably have 3 who sympathize with me, but the rest is still a process of convincing and moving forward. We provided them a space to express uncomfortable views. Fine, someone feels it's okay to beat their wives, that's okay, let's discuss it. We had to hold the women back and tell them, listen, in this space they can say whatever they want, they have to be comfortable, and you should not immediately. There were some, of course, women who jumped up to argue, would you like it if we beat you? But we said no, not at this forum, maybe at a later place. We had to find relevant examples. As I mentioned, reluctance. This is a tax agency. Why do they want to know? There's a big resistance to monitoring at that level, which I hadn't realized when I went in. The selection of the SHGs, and then achieving a gender balance. I was delighted. All my years at the World Bank, one of my constant complaints was that we were always preaching to the converted. You have any meeting, you always, on gender, you had women there. You rarely had men. Once in a way, someone will stream through. But here, we almost had 60% men. So it was a great delight to be able to talk to the men and tell them that women have achieved independence, the egg is broken. Now, unless you change, we're going to have problems. And there are also ethical dilemmas, because do you impose gender equality on them? You can tell them, and then they have to decide how to do it, what is the preferred method. And this seriously was a problem as to how exactly to deal with that, and that was caused some problems. I won't go into that. Strength. So what were the results? There's some strength in capacity, some data for management by the groups. There's a gender action plan that has come up. We also, in order, as I first mentioned, we were trying to influence policy makers. We have come up with a document like this. We have given it to several of those people, especially the planning board, and the planning board has said they will definitely consider this. Increased and improved partnerships have come up. We are now partnering with the the Women's Commission. And in many cases, people are talking the language of gender equality. Now, what did the survey, when we tested it out, what did we find? We found that chairmen, there are 33% women. Not 33%, sorry, 33 women and 102. So the chairman is clearly, but the treasurer is certainly, treasurers and secretaries are higher. Now, I would have argued typically, if I was doing that, we need equal numbers of women and equal numbers of men in all 3 areas. But in this, I did not, because I didn't want to threaten the chair people at that point of time. Another very interesting thing that came out was, is alcohol a problem in your household? And 50%, 52% said not a problem, but 48% actually said it was a problem, low, modest or high. So along with, through this participatory approach, not only did we try and disseminate an approach of gender equality, but also one where we developed this survey instrument. So I look forward to receive, because I can see you're a very experienced group, to getting some comments and guidance from you on what we should do or what we could do better. Thank you.
Thank you, Gita, so much for your real-world experiences in designing a survey instrument. Are there any questions?
Ajit from Amaltash. I couldn't make out whether this was a research to generate knowledge or whether this was a project to change attitudes.
We'll take a couple of questions before.
I have a question. What were the challenges faced for designing and selecting your gender-specific indicators?
I'm Shobham from the Institute of Social Studies Trust, and I kept relating your presentation to one of our experiences, which was a collaborative baseline which we did for a women's empowerment project. And I was just wondering if I mean, we faced a lot of challenges, and I was wondering if you faced any such challenges and how you dealt with them in training these SHG members or activists or implementation personnel, in training them to conduct a survey, or in or if they face any challenges in going out and conducting surveys, because how did they fit into this role? Did they have any problems? Because they're not, they're used to more of an activist role rather than a surveyor. So if you can talk a little bit.
Go ahead and answer these, then we'll take another round of questions.
Sorry. First, we had only CLEAR's financial support. Okay, so we had to use that support for two purposes. One was to not to disseminate knowledge as much, but to change mindsets about how you address effective development effectiveness, and what was not working. So that was one area. The second area was through the first level of testing of the monitoring instrument to be able to get knowledge from that group as to how they were functioning. So they were combined really in a participatory way, and much as I had told John and Diva that we were taking a big risk, I think towards the end those fitted in very well together. So both would be my answer to you. Both, in fact, there would be three objectives that we had. Please.
So I'll just add a little bit to that, to the gentleman's question. And so I think what was interesting about the survey that eventually happened was, so in the cases as Harini and Diva presented earlier, it's kind of, you have policymakers and researchers kind of interested in a particular question, developing an instrument which is going to bring out an answer to that question, like a valid answer. And in this case, which was very different, and it was a new experience for us as Clear South Asia, what it was involved in going to a sample of these 65,000 self-help groups and representative across the 14 districts, and kind of turning it around. It wasn't Clear or the World Bank or the central government asking questions about what the impact of the self-help groups. It was asking them to figure out what was important to monitor their own progress. So there were certain cues about questions about gender, but a lot of the other questions were more about what you might expect out of a self-help group. So questions about financial inclusion, changes in income, changes in expenditure. But then the questions that came up through related to gender were questions that had validity for them as the self-help group, and not questions that we imposed on them. So that was kind of the participatory nature. And so it was, I think for now, the first part is, as Gita said, it's both. It's first kind of looking at baseline, what they feel is important to measure. And then over time, as you have more loans go out, can you track changes over time? So there's just another perspective to complement what Gita presented.
Excellent point, John, because as you said, they were not the sources. They were actually trying to identify what information was most important for them and to obtain that information, rather than as in your typical where they are really the sources of the information. Now the second question was gender-specific monitors. Now this was very difficult to actually introduce. So what we did was the Indian Constitution. We started off talking about the Indian Constitution and the framework that it provides. It says equality in social, political, and economic. So we used that as the framework and said, okay, in these three areas, find out how would you like to measure whether you're progressing further. So every other hour we would mention the Constitution, because this is not an imported idea to make that to them. Then it became very easy when you had a framework to measure economic, social, and then for economic we focused on savings, loans, and income. On social we focused on alcohol. This was very difficult and very sensitive. In fact, we had a much tougher question in the first one, but then people came back and said no. Although it gave us good fairly good information. They came back and they said, no, this question's not going to work. Not too many people answered. But when we actually looked at it, we did get a lot of answers. So we've softened it now. We've added a question as to, is there anybody in your household who drinks alcohol? And then the second one, is this alcohol consumption causing any problems? So our information will be much less. We won't be able to say high, low, medium. But since it's a pilot, we thought we could test it out, and at the very end, we could decide what to do. And then the other was voice and participation, which we are looking at through management level. So that's how, so the indicators the gender-related indicators did not turn out to be too difficult once we had the framework. And the other question, and the other question was as to how difficult and challenging it was. It was, but Kerala being having such high levels of education really helped. So that made it better. Once they had gotten into the whole thing, they started getting much better and much more enthusiastic. And we were able to narrow it down. As I said, from 56, we landed up with 40. And those 40 are extremely interested, and majority of them are actually men. Actually, the women eventually were less enthusiastic, but the men were much more enthusiastic by the end of it. Does that answer your question?
Actually, my question was slightly different.
Okay.
We, during our baseline survey, the training and the actual data collection, we felt that and the activists themselves, they felt this sort of a contradiction within themselves, because they are not used to the role of surveyors. They are activists. They are used to mobilizing people, helping them out, access certain things. They're not used to getting information and then not doing anything about it right there and then, or not asking questions that actually don't lead them to answering a certain way. Things like those.
No, we did not have that problem, partly because most of them, more than activists, are really what you could call grassroots development leaders, because they're focused on developing the few groups that they each manage or each help. So they're there very often, talking to them, finding out what doesn't work and trying to report it. What they understood, therefore, by the end of the process was that we were trying to set up a system through which they probably could report more systematically. So yes, at the beginning, and it's still going to take time because they still don't do it correctly. So either we have to change the monitoring tool through the next 2 workshops, or train them more so that they fully understand it. Many of them came back. We had a policy workshop. Many of them came to me and said, "Oh, we did it wrong. We now understand. So maybe you want to give it back to us. We'll take it." Now, Janasree groups hold a meeting every week. The group gets together, and these people go there very often to find out, what they're meeting, what they just as a courtesy, and to find out whether they're getting their loans properly, whether they are repaying properly, etc. So it didn't add too much of a burden for them. So that was the advantage. Plus, as I said, there were no incentives, so they knew they had to do this as part of the job. So.
Hi. Actually, I have a comment, and I was just thinking loud about the work you are doing. To my understanding, if I understand well, you are doing a pilot, and it will be going on for 1 year, right? Yeah. And after that, are you planning to do some intervention, or simultaneously or concurrently you are doing something? Because my next query related to this would be, what at the end of the day, what you are going to see? Because if your intervention is going concurrently along with your pilot testing, getting the baseline, then I think at the end of the day, 2 year down the lane or 1.5 year down the lane, it might be you might find difficulty in measuring the changes. And number 2 thing is, it's such, I understand that the self-help groups are for the empowerment of women, and as I understand in Kerala, they are doing they're working very nicely. And so, in terms of gender, are you planning something more empowering the women, or empowering the men in your self-help groups? I don't know. I'm just wondering what are you thinking about this?
because I understand that just keep giving them reservations or giving them allot certain positions to them might not lead to true empowerment, rather than bringing the empowerment gradually and sensitizing them. And I think so there are two ways of thinking.
Oh, sorry. We actually have a gender action plan that we have developed also, because this was also used to piggy bank, and we call it Janasree Vision 2025. So it's going to take a long time. We have suggested research on alcohol, gender violence, plus economic support, because that's part of the Janasree's larger objective. Second, what use you said do you see of these? We are hoping, the groups themselves will know how well they are functioning. Has their income been increasing because of Janasree interventions? Do they have more savings today? Loans, what are they using the loans for? So there's a number of things that we hope to get very rich information. One, for them themselves to be using in determining how they want to move forward. And secondly, for the Janasree leaders to see. I mean, I don't think we'll ever be able to extend to 65,000 groups, but we are hoping that by the pilot is still not really established. This is only the participatory process that it has taken. It may take another 6 months actually to establish the pilot, and that pilot will be in 750 groups. Then we'll again see how that's working. Is it cost effective? Are we getting the information that we want? Are we reaching the objectives? We're talking about this information should actually empower women and men, and as they move forward. Is it achieving that? We will find out at the end of next year when we've got the pilot. Thank you.
We have time for one final question. No, as you said, we hope we will also find the same thing, that capacity is being built up, and that they're more involved in determining the activities and much more involved in doing that in a gender equitable or equal way. The next one was, how do you interact the integrity of the information you're getting? It is a problem, it is an issue, and there are trade-offs to be made in participatory approaches that I haven't found an answer, and I would love to hear some answers. We are trying to establish monitors. We are trying to allow 2 people to go when they do the thing. We are at the instance of CLEAR's guidance, we are trying to set up backup checks, including many of us will go and just randomly check information, etc. But nevertheless, in a participatory kind of process, there are, as you said, these three actually different and distinct objectives that you're trying, and in that it is likely you may lose some rigor. I would only turn to all of you to give me any guidance if you've done it. I'm very happy to hear that this participatory work does eventually lead to some capacity strengthening. But if any of you have any suggestions for us as how when you're doing it, you're maintaining the integrity of the information, I'd be very grateful. I also want to tell you, if any of you come to Kerala, please definitely visit us. Janasree is there on the web page. So if you
type Janasree gender in Google, you'll get it. Please feel free to come and visit us and guide us if you can. Of course, we can't afford to pay you anything, but I do voluntary work also, so any information or exchange of information would be very helpful for us. Thank you.
Just one very quick thing before we close the session. Could everyone please fill up their feedback forms? It's really important. Your suggestions help us a lot. I'd like to hand over the mic to John now, who would give some closing comments, please.
Again, thank everyone very much for coming and participating actively today. I think it's been very interesting, and I hope it's also been useful. I think sometimes it's helpful to take a step back and kind of look about. This was a quite technical session, both in terms of designing, going about how you design an instrument to pilot, and how, the process that Gita went through at Janasree for a participatory approach, and kind of revisiting, why this is important and why this is essential. And I think if evaluation is going to link, that's the hope, that evaluation is going to lead to learning and accountability that will lead to better programming to improve the lives of the poor. And so every aspect of it in terms of how to get quality data to be basing these decisions on is extremely important. So in terms of instrument design, that's one step in the process. You also have, having representative sampling, having trained field teams, entering the data with good quality, data analysis. But each step has to be kind of rigorous and valid to be able to trust the data and to be able to have credibility to be basing decisions upon the data. So from that perspective, I thought it was very useful to hear from Diva and from Harini about really over the 70 evaluations that JPAL's done in South Asia, what are some of the systems that we have in place and some of the details that we have when we look to design a questionnaire or to train a field team. And I think that that we have a good reputation for coming up with highly internally valid evaluations, and a lot of that is based on the quality of the data. And I thought that Gita's presentation was a nice kind of juxtaposition. Here, I think the credibility, at least for Janasree, is not necessarily on having the most innovative instrument or tool. So what they came up with was a two-page tool that it's good and it's quite straightforward. But the huge thing about that tool is that it's owned by the self-help groups themselves. So thinking about how that links into their policy, they're generating information that they feel is important. And you've already seen that in terms of building up credibility within the organization of the study. That is a very high degree of credibility, which has then allowed them with confidence to approach the chief minister, the chief secretary, the planning board for funds, because the information that's coming out of this survey is valuable to them. So it's a very different type of process, but I thought it was very illustrative to have these kind of two sides of one coin of how you come up with an instrument presented today. So now we've got refreshments and coffee and tea outside, and a chance for us to interact and continue the conversation. And we'll probably have the next round table. I think what we'll be doing over the next few months is we'll do technical roundtables like this. Probably the next one will be on managing field teams. And then they'll be kind of interspliced maybe with some presentations from researchers on their own evaluations, as well as presentations for the process of thinking about linking evaluation better to policy. So on behalf of JPAL South Asia and on behalf of Clear South Asia, thank you very much for attending today, and look forward to continuing the conversation now and in the weeks to come. Thank you.